All right, so I guess we should go ahead. I teased it a little bit, but let's go ahead and talk about the real world experience of towing with the 2020, the 2020 Tundra that I have that doesn't have the trans cooler versus the 2018 that came with the factory trans cooler. Now, as many people may remember, this was a big deal back 2019, 2020, 2021. The last 3 years of the second generation Toyota Tundra, they didn't put the auxiliary trans cooler even with their tow package, and I think on the 19s they even listed it as there even though it wasn't there because they didn't change their labeling, and then that turned into a little bit of a fiasco and certainly a point of contention. There were a number of videos out there discussing trans cooler versus not, and I have to tell you, I'm somebody with as much towing as I do and as heavy as it is, I would definitely want that trans cooler. However, the way it's worked out, I've had the truck for a little over a year now. The 2020, I got it in 2024 with 14,000 miles on it. I've put, it's just past 40,000 miles. Most of those miles have been towing miles. And I'm going to talk to you about what I've done and what my experience is with that as we've gone through it. Now, the first thing I would tell you is that the first thing we should look at is what's really going on? What's out there in terms of, have there been transmission failures? And if you look at the NHTSA data, they have for 2019 a total of 5 complaints, for 2020 a total of 3 complaints, and for 2021 a total of 2 complaints. Most of those complaints, I don't think any of them are actually failures. Most of them were for slippage or excessive noise, going into gear heavily, those sort of things. Those were the NHTSA complaints that they got. And so whatever problem this has been so far is very, very small. And certainly with the 2019s, we're looking at almost a full 6 years now of those, really going on 7 years, because almost 7 years, because this is March of 2025, and those went into production in August of 2018. So almost 7 years since they were out, very, very few complaints. Now, what there are reports of out on the internet is higher fluid temps from about 225 even up to 300. Some people have seen temperatures. I think the highest I saw was 304 degrees Fahrenheit. So from 225 to 304 degrees, which is pretty darn high. The highest I had ever seen on my 2018 towing, in southern Utah in the mountains at 65 miles per hour-ish, was about 218. Rarely did I see numbers over 206. And again, I need to point out that was on a 98-degree day, but rarely did I see temps over 206. Occasionally I'd approach 212, and just that one time I saw 218. So that was the only time I ever saw a 218 come up on my trans temp. Now, that being said, the 2020 that I have now, I've seen some temperatures well beyond that. As a matter of fact, the temperatures will go up in about 210 to 212 range just driving around town. I live in an area where it's fairly hilly, and where where I drive go up and down hills quite a bit, and that seems to cause this these transmission temps without that auxiliary cooler to go up to a pretty decent number. I don't ever see it above 220 really without some sort of load on the vehicle. But with load on the vehicle, I definitely see it go above 220. The highest I personally have seen is 260. Now, I've decided I'm not going to get the auxiliary trans cooler for a couple reasons. One reason, the lesser of the reasons, is that, hey, for purposes of making videos going forward and for long-term evaluation of these vehicles, because let's face it, there's a number of us out there like myself that think this is one of the greatest, if not the greatest half-ton ever made, is going to be to document this for people so that they have something to go look at and say, hey, did this ever fail or not fail? At what point did it fail? Because I use this thing under a fair amount of strain. I tow a travel trailer across the country 4 or 5 times a year typically. Long distances, long legs. Sometimes I'll do legs of 1,000 miles in a day. And when I do that, I'm always monitoring those temperatures. And again, I can tell you my 18 always did really well. So that's the lesser of the 2 reasons. The main of the 2 reasons is because towing in S4 or sequential shift 4 mode, right, which locks the locks the torque converter up at a 1-to-1 ratio, tends to keep the temperatures down quite a bit. Now, not as low as they were in my 2018, but they do keep it down. It's rare for me to see a temp above 220. For the most part, it's hovering right around 208 to 210 when I'm towing now, but that's when I'm in S4. Now you may say to yourself, "Hey, what are the benefits of towing in S4 versus what are the consequences of towing in S4?" Well, the benefits are number one, there's less wear because of the less heat, right? You stay in S4. It's less strain on the engine. It's less strain on the transmission itself, and that in and of itself creates less heat. Heat is the biggest component when it comes to wear, and so that's one of the big things. There's also less lugging of the engine, meaning that less strain, meaning your RPMs aren't too high, your RPMs aren't too low relative to the load you've got on it. And this is a bigger deal when you're at heavier loads or you're going up steep hills. And so you get less what was called lugging of the engine, again, less wear. Well, what are the consequences of it? Well, and I should also say there's better torque at lower end speeds. Because there's better torque at lower end speeds, again, if you have a fairly heavy load, it's going to allow you to handle that load a little bit better. For me, it means a travel trailer that I tow across country. Now, what are the cons of it? Well, the biggest con is fuel economy. Now, here's an interesting thing to note about that. So when I'm in my current vehicle, my 2020, and I towed all the way to Texas and back, and I hated it, but I stayed in S6, except for the same times that I would have gone into S4 with my 2018. Which the only time I went into S4 with my 2018 was pretty much in very hilly areas where there was a lot of up and down, or for areas where there were long ascents or descents, I would switch to S4, and that suited my 2018 just fine. Now, in the 2020, my preference would be to be in S4 all the time when I'm towing. But I thought, to really see this, I've got to do a trip without it. What I found is sometimes even on flat ground, but definitely if it was just a little bit hilly, that's where I would see those temperatures climb. Regularly, the truck was at about 230, and I would see it spike to 240 or 250, and a couple times even 260 Fahrenheit on those temps. Really hated it, but did it because I wanted to see it. Relatively long trip through a lot of mountains out to Wyoming and Idaho late this summer in September. Put a lot of miles on at that point in time, a lot through the mountains. Highest I ever saw at that point was about 230. But mostly it stayed in that 208 to 210. But if it was something really steep, I could see it climb a little bit above 220, but rarely saw 220 while I was doing that. Now, but what about the fuel mileage? Well, here's the interesting thing I noticed. And then there was a trip to Florida. Florida's relatively flat. Never really from Georgia to Florida. So from leaving from my house in Augusta down to Florida, it's pretty flat terrain for most of the way. A little bit of hills in Georgia, not much. Start getting to South Georgia, gets pretty flat. Never really saw anything go above about 212 on that trip. So keeping it in S4, that stays pretty good. The trade-off is the MPGs. Now, here's what I mean by that, because it's not as bad as it might sound initially. On my way out to the West Texas, I did several legs. I was averaging going 65 to 70 most of the time. I was averaging about 10.5 miles per gallon. I was maybe 10.3. I was right between 10.0 and 10.6 on my way out. Really good fuel economy. And that was heading east, which is usually my worst leg. Coming back, did almost the exact same thing. With the Airstream, that seems to be typical. It isn't as affected as much as my previous Lance travel trailers were by the direction I'm heading, meaning if I'm heading westward into the wind, generally speaking, generally a lot worse with the Lance travel trailer than it is with the Airstream. And then coming back west to east, the Lance generally did a lot better. whereas the Airstream does about the same both directions. So, but the trade-off was when I took that big trip out west, instead of averaging about 10.3-ish, let's say, I averaged about 9.7. So maybe it cost me half a mile a gallon to go out that direction and back. But here's where the bigger change was. I had to move a dining room table for my wife. I had to move, well, actually what I had to do was go pick it up in Atlanta and then move it here to our house. She wanted a 10-foot long dining room table for our ever expanding family. So I picked up a U-Haul here, put my truck in S4, and it was just an empty, open U-Haul trailer. And in S4 on I-20 between my house and Atlanta, which is some decent up and down hills, but isn't terrible, I got about 10.7 with an empty trailer behind me. Now, that was interesting to me when I got there. So I thought, you know what? This isn't that heavy. I'm going to put it back in. I'm going to take it out of S4. I'm going to put it in S6 for the way home. And I want to see what it does. And on the way back, I said, all right, I'm going to leave the in S6. And I averaged on the way back about, I think it was about 13.6, 13.7 with the same trailer, this time with a 10-foot dining room table in it. And on the way back, my trans temps were creeping up to about 230. The trade-off is at a lower weight, I can't get as good MPGs as I used to. Now, staying in S4 with a heavy travel trailer doesn't really change as much, because I'm going to be probably downshifting a good portion, or the truck is going to be downshifting for me a good portion of the time anyway. And with that heavy load being in S4, it didn't change it as much. Like I said, maybe half a mile-ish per gallon is what it changed it. So ultimately, I think the trade-off I'm going to make is I'm going to give up that little bit of a fuel economy benefit, stay in S4 when towing, and see what that does relative to the longevity of this transmission, because I don't plan on getting rid of this truck. So in comparing the 18 to the 20, so the 2018 with the trans cooler, I use S4 strictly for hilly regions and long ascents and descents, basically. And when I'm not towing heavy in the 18, I can leave it in S6 and my miles per gallon will go up, but my trans temps don't go up. Probably does put a little bit of extra strain on the engine, but and on the transmission, but not that significant when I've got a lighter load. In the 20, I have to be in S4 all the time when I've got any sort of a load, or those trans temps are going to shoot up. Now, my alternative would be to say, all right, I'm going to go get the auxiliary trans cooler that I can pick up for about $1,300, but I don't think that's necessary for the, half a mile per gallon to maybe a mile per gallon at the most that it's going to change. And I'm probably doing the truck better by staying in S4. So the S4 keeps the temps respectable, but it'll keep those temps respectable, but it'll also hurt your MPGs just a little bit. If you're out there wondering about, hey, I've got a 2019 through a 2021, and I'm wondering if I need the trans cooler or not, I hope this helps you make that decision on that. And again, if you've got some other thoughts, please share them with me, because the more we share on this stuff, the more we all learn.